us. I'm Gabriela Martinez, Director of Education at the Museum of Latin American Art, and on behalf of the rest of the MOLA staff, I would like to welcome you to our Afternoon for Educators, Trauma and Art Therapy. MOLA's art education programs depend on support by the Roomba Grant and the Dwight Stewart Youth Fund, two major supporters without whom we would not have been able to get through this very tough year. And the museum receives additional support from the Robert Gumbiner Foundation, the Arts Council of Long Beach, and the City of Long Beach. And this afternoon's workshop will be facilitated by two wonderful guests, Dr. Maricel Ocasio-Figueroa and Stephanie Soler. So Doctora Maricel Ocasio-Figueroa, ATRBC, is a practicing art therapist and clinical psychologist licensed in Puerto Rico. After completing her studies in Washington, D.C. and moving back to the island, she co-founded the Puerto Rico Art Therapy Association. She's worked with a variety of special projects that incorporate both of her fields of study to impact, among others, families of accidentally burned children, youth through a museum-based SEL program, and students in the public school system. She has a private practice, a mental health startup, consults for PRDE on PBIS, and is a proud mama to two amazing boys. Ms. Stephanie Soler is an expressive arts therapist, artist, and educator. She holds a BA in psychology from the University of Puerto Rico, an MA in clinical mental health counseling and expressive arts therapy from Lesley University, and a voluntary internship from Harvard University's Cultural Agents Initiative. She specializes in trauma and expressive arts therapy. She's worked with children and adolescents with and without functional diversity in Indonesia, Nicaragua, and Puerto Rico, as well as victims and survivors of gender-based violence, people without homes and chronic health conditions, veterans, immigrants, older adults, LGBTQIA+ community, pediatric burn survivors, the Department of Education of Puerto Rico, and the Ponce Art Museum. Her work parts from an intersectional and Caribbean perspective within the mental health field and a cultural agency. So we will be gathering your questions. I'm going to turn it over to Maricel and Stephanie in just a moment, but just letting you know that they will be answering or responding to questions at the end of the program, but you're more than welcome. If you want to jot them down, you can also enter them in the chat and I'll be collecting them and forwarding those questions to them. So again, make sure you have your materials ready, and we hope you enjoy this really wonderful presentation.
Gracias, Gabriela. It's a pleasure for us to be here tonight. We're actually a couple of hours ahead of you, so it's a good night from us, but your afternoon, almost night there. This is very exciting. It's the first webinar we offer during this pandemic that's across states. So it's very exciting. We've been offering a lot of webinars, but mostly in Puerto Rico. So as Gabriela mentioned, please feel free to share your thoughts and comments and questions in the chat, ideally, because we have a short amount of time, a lot of information to share with you. And we would like for you to take as much from this webinar as possible. Yet there's a lot of information. So bear with us. We'll go pretty fast in some of those slides just to make sure that we cover them. If you have any questions, you can ask them later, but we want to provide you with a lot of resources that you can then later use and seek out more of the information that is relevant to you specifically, okay? So with that said, is there anything else you would like to add?
Just thank you for being here and for taking the time to learn with us and expand the field of art therapy and the use of art therapy and therapeutic art activities during this time that I think that there's a lot of trauma and a lot of stuff that has happened. So I think it's something that may be useful to everyone that works with children and youth. So
thank you. So with that said, we hope you have a space that's somewhat free of distractions, that you can incorporate the art making as you see fit. Gabriela mentioned the materials that we requested. Those particularly, the images will be used at the end, but we will be making a short art activity now starting, and it can be with whatever materials you would like. So we'll present particular ones, but feel free to use whatever you have available. No need to get stressed because you don't have watercolors or pastels. It's we can kind of flow with whatever you have, okay? So I'm gonna share my screen now. There we go. share computer sound as well.
No todavía.
No?
Cuando...
There you go.
Ah, tú dices
Push
cuando
it.
pide. No,
Ajá.
en lo que estamos hablando.
Okay. So here we go. Linda, I can see you. Can you see the screen and us as well? Yes, thank you. Okay. So good evening. We'll be talking about trauma and art therapy. As stated here, some of our objectives tonight will be to learn how trauma is experienced, its neurological and emotional impact, learn basic understanding of what the art therapy field entails, and learn how to use Lowenfeld stages of creative development, as well as the Expressive Therapies Continuum, to decide what creative activities to engage with our students in order to mitigate the impact of trauma. And we'll incorporate some hands-on creative experiences so you can make practical sense of the theoretical information we'll be providing. Again, it's a lot, but we'll try to keep it short and sweet and to the point. So in order to begin, we like to usually be very interactive in our presentations. Again, we have short amount of time. We do this type of webinar for 6 hours. So we're crunching it today to 1.5. So you can imagine, but we want you to feel settled and present. So in order to do that, we'll engage in this first activity. I'm gonna simply play a bell, a sound. And I would like for you to sit comfortably. If you can put your back and rest it on the back of your chair, put the soles of your feet, if you're barefoot, or your shoes flat on the floor, palms on your thighs. And simply, if you feel comfortable, close your eyes and just listen to the sound. That's all there is to it, okay? I'm gonna ring the bells a couple of times. Simply listen to the sound. So when you feel comfortable, you can open your eyes again and be present in this moment. Look around and see if you can name one thing you can look at. Name in your head something you can smell. Something you can feel or taste. A sound you can hear. Hopefully you're more present now than before when we started. And we would like to give you an alternative for this icebreaker kind of mindful little activity, which is with children. What we do is present. We're gonna ring a bell and we're gonna ask you to do like a dog does. What do they do when they hear a sound? Right, they raise their ears, right? And they look for the sound. Where is it coming from, right? So when I ring the bell, you're gonna get your puppy ears up and look for the sound. You can close your eyes so you can really focus on that sound and the sound almost ending, and you can listen until the end. And when you can't hear anything else, then you put your palms back on your thighs, okay? So we'll do a couple more sounds, pretending we're kids and doing puppy's listening to the sound, okay? So here we go. Okay, good. You follow instructions really well. I see you, Linda. Good job. a lot of times kids will play with the not actually, doing this. And so, all the other kids may look at the one who's not following instructions and be like, oh, you're listening to the sound. So it's a nice way to get them to interact, to be present in the moment, and kind of give a little ritual to the beginning, either of class or of the day or of the special activity you're about to embark in. And then the last version of this that we'll like to give you 3 minutes to explore is to focus on your breathing, now that you're a little bit more present as your adult self, and simply notice if it's faster than usual, deeper maybe now, shallow, and just be with it for a second. Look at your art materials and choose one that you would like to use to help you represent visually how that breathing is coming in and out of your system. So Stephanie's gonna use the chalk pastels. I'm gonna use some watercolors so we can share for you how they look like, or what they look like. Choose whichever you want and go ahead. There's no right or wrong way of doing it. You simply choose a color that speaks to you and try to represent your breathing somehow. Mm-hmm. So let's see. How was that for you?
It was okay. One thing that I wanted to add with this is, like, I was doing it with one hand, and I usually enjoy doing this activity with both hands because I stimulate kind of, both sides. So it's like bilateral work, and kind of with both my hands try and trace my breath. So the first pattern was just kind of, it was a little bit all over the place. We're starting the presentation, so I was breathing a little bit faster, making sure everything's ready. And then as I consciously try to make my breaths longer, then the movements became longer, right? And the inhales, I would go up, and then the exhales, I would go down. And then the touch was softer as well as I softened my breath. So that was kind of how it was for me.
So I incorporated the watercolors, and I have to say, switching from presenting to making art was more stressful than this represent. But I was really trying to be conscious about regulating my breathing. So for whatever reason, I changed colors. I'm not sure why, but it really did help to see the strokes as I was painting to kind of regulate my breathing, if that makes sense.
Yeah, because basically you're creating an external representation of that breath pattern, right? And oftentimes we sometimes place our hand in our chest and in our bellies, but this is another kind of more visual way and touch way to visualize what that breathing is like. So this is one activity that can be used as a warm-up to just kind of ground, to transition from one, right? Even maybe in another class or right now that we're virtual, your kitchen table might be the classroom, and there's people or somebody working on, on the side, and then there's my little sister or brother maybe over here. So the kind of, there aren't a lot of boundaries between the spaces that we inhabit. And sometimes just doing an activity to transition from one kind of mental space to the other really helps. And as we go deeper into kind of trauma, we'll notice that those transitions are important. So that's why we want to practice this with you. So you can also, we try and do it experiential and with the short amount of time that we have, but it's something that you can also just kind of go practicing during your week to see how the images also are different as you practice that kind of being aware of your breath, and then how becoming aware of your breath, you can actually then maybe change your breath a little bit.
And get settled down as well. So
yeah.
In the context of offering this webinar, I think we're all pretty aware of the fact that the world is going through a pandemic right now. On top of that, us coming from Puerto Rico, we come from a particular set of traumatic experiences in the past years. So we would like to share with you some resources to help as those significant adults in the students' lives to help incorporate art activities that will help mitigate the impact of the traumatic experience of the pandemic and other factors that we know affect different populations that you serve. So as I mentioned, we shared a lot of information within the presentation, the PowerPoint. You will receive it, so you can go ahead and further look into those resources that most interest you. We're going to share a little video that gives a context of the importance of building capacity, providing the skills to the adults that are in constant contact with the children. We would like to share that now and to get some of your feedback.
The social challenges that face modern societies, whether it's the ability to work productively, to be a good citizen, stay healthy, have their roots in early health and development. A strong foundation in early childhood results in much better and more effective development later. A weak foundation really puts us behind. The most important thing children need to thrive is to live in an environment of relationships that begins in their family, but also extends out to include adults who are family members in child care centers and other programs. What children need is for that entire environment of relationships to be invested in their healthy development. We've shown from decades of testing interventions that we can improve outcomes. But the magnitude of those impacts is not good enough. Science is now available to help us think about what we might do that would have a bigger impact than the best of what we've done before. So we began to ask, what could we be doing differently? What could we do to be smarter? Children who are at the greatest risk for the poorest outcomes in learning and health and behavior are children who experience a pile-up, the cumulative burden of one after another of risk factors. And then the burden is more than any child could be expected to overcome. So we began to focus on the development of the adults. What could we be doing to strengthen the capacity of everyone who interacts with children? This led us to think about the kinds of skills you need to deal with adversity. These skills of focusing attention, planning, monitoring, delaying gratification, being able to solve problems, being able to work in teams, executive function, and self-regulation. They're also the kind of skills you need to create a well-regulated home and school environment in which healthy development and learning can take place. And then brain science started to tell us that differences in those skills start to develop in infancy based on the environment kids live in. So how do those skills get built? Well, if you don't develop them early, how do you develop them later? Actually, you can build them later because the period of flexibility and plasticity for this part of the brain doesn't fully mature until age 25 to 30. And then the light bulb went on. The reason we're not getting a bigger impact is not because we don't know about how to influence development, but because we're giving information and advice to people who we need to do active skill building with. Skill building by coaching, by training, by practice, but we're not doing that. So we now have developed this theory of change that says we need to focus on the development of the adults who are important in kids' lives.
So try this.
How does that work?
That's a new idea. Buen trabajo.
We need to focus on their skills, their needs, in order for them to be better, more effective parents, in order for them to be better prepared to be employable, which would enhance the economic stability of the family, which is also good for children. Second of all, we looked at many people in preschool programs and childcare centers. And we said, what are we doing to build those skills in the providers? They need skill building as well. And also the community can help to build and reinforce the capacities that parents need. And the community also includes programs in which the people who work in the programs have sufficient skills. Third of all, what are the major sources of toxic stress in this community, and how can we reduce them? Moving it up to a policy level, how are our policies strengthening communities' abilities to reduce source of toxic stress and caregivers' abilities to provide what kids need? The development of our human capital is our future. The development of a productive workforce is our future. The development of a healthy population is our future. This kind of future orientation is critical for healthy society. It's critical for a thriving business. It's critical for successful environmental relationships to raise children. It's all about being able to plan for the future, to have a future. And that's why this is so important.
So clearly, we need to, as adults, or agents of change in the child's life, to develop the skills necessary to model for them emotional regulation, decision making. So that's part of the reason why we're here today, to get some skills the practical skills that will help us incorporate the arts in a way that potentially will diminish the impact that those toxic stressors or trauma that they've experienced will have in their adult life. So what is trauma? It's an event experienced by an individual where their life or that of a loved one is at risk or danger of physical and or emotional harm. There's a clear before and after the trauma in their life. We can attest to living through the Hurricane Maria experience. Most Puerto Ricans will say, oh, that was before Maria, blah, 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 and tell you the story. Oh, no, that's after Maria. And now, the pandemic, it's, oh, it was before COVID. Oh, actually, we joke here that it was after Maria, prior to the COVID, but after the earthquakes. So there's a significant impact that a traumatic event has on a person's life. And we joke as a defense mechanism, but also because it's funny because it's true. We've struggled to kind of get back up after another slap on the face, right? So that's what happens with complex trauma. Simple trauma, it's a singular event that happens in someone's life in a somewhat of a vacuum, but a complex trauma is various events that have occurred either continuously through a person's development or in quick succession in their life and are usually relational in nature. So trauma commonly disorients an individual by distorting their perception of the world. A person may feel like the world is not safe anymore. It'll alter their brain and their body. Physiologically, the sensations, they feel potentially hyper alert or more sensitive to different stimuli and develop a sense of insecurity. Some traumatic events can be defined under these categories of violence, natural disasters, accidents. As Gabriela had mentioned, we've worked with children who've accidentally been burned. So that's a particular type of traumatic experience, and very different from experiencing an earthquake, for example. And it's also very different from living in a community or a unsafe neighborhood. But they're all considered traumatic experiences. So some things to consider: the following influence the possibility of trauma experienced negatively in the person, in a student, in a child. So the intensity is something that we consider that's important. It's the force in which that event occurs. So for example, talking about the child who's been accidentally burned, that's a very intense experience, right? It's a severe chronic event, yet the duration, how long it lasts, it can last a short amount of time or longer, but tends to be short. Usually someone pushes them to the floor and rolls them over, or luckily turns the flames off. The frequency, usually it's just a one single event. So it's the number of times that it's occurred. When we talk about sexual abuse, for example, then the intensity, it could be a very intense experience. The duration can be even longer, because then there's frequency of every other Saturday that the child sees the stepfather, for example, and the duration is however long they have a period by themselves in the household. So as you can see, the intensity, duration, and frequency relate in a way that makes that experience more potentially more traumatic than or less. The level of which each person is affected varies depending on the individual and the environmental protective factors that surround them. So social emotional skills, it's one of those protective factors that children and adults have. Considering children have had less experience in life, then they potentially need to continue to reinforce and continue to develop those skills. Environmentally, family members are a key factor that helps determine how a child will react to traumatic experience, be that how they respond to that experience as their parents, but also if they've been impacted directly, by providing a sense of security and predictability. A general positive and emotionally supportive environment makes a huge difference. Access to health resources, that's key. As well as participating in social, extracurricular, sports, or artistic activities that provide an outlet. Activation, well, I'm gonna close this. You wanna take over?
Oh,
Sí. So
okay.
I'll pass, no, I'm passing the torch to Stephanie.
Okay, so just to, well, yo haré la quinta, so it's easier.
Okay.
Okay. So this is right, like it's a lot of information and we're condensing it. I'm going really fast through it. But just to kind of recap the important parts as we go, right, continuing to kind of the second part of what we're gonna talk about trauma. So what is trauma? An event where like your life or the life of someone that you love is at risk. So maybe the danger didn't occur, but it's sort of like you're really fearful that something really dangerous might have occurred, or the danger did occur, right? And there's a clear before and after. There's two types. There's the simple, which is usually like a theft, maybe on a car accident, so kind of a single event. And then there's a complex, which can be multiple traumas that get layered and layered and layered. And usually complex trauma, known as CPTSD, is a lot of like relational in nature. So think about a child or somebody who's in an abusive home, right? That the abuse, that relationship is kind of going through the child's development. And then the intensity, the duration, and the frequency. So just to kind of keep highlighting and reminding that, because those are all concepts that you'll have to kind of start adding into your trauma lens. Right, we have fight, flight, and freeze. We've usually heard about those three responses, and fawn, which we're not going to touch much on. So fight or flight is kind of the first response that our body has to danger, right? So think you're in the woods and you maybe see a bear, and you're either, right, like your body's instinct is like either to go running, right, to flee. You usually like want to flee the situation, but if you find that you can't flee the situation, then you opt for fighting, right? And you're gonna try and see if you can defend yourself. And if you can't defend yourself, then you fall into the next one, which will go into the next slide. So what happens with a fight or flight is that the sympathetic nervous system gets activated, right? And then that releases a lot of neurochemicals. So adrenaline, norepinephrine, cortisol, pupils dilate, our heart rate starts, right, increasing, we sweat, we start breathing, right, shorter breaths, but quicker breaths. So think about the sympathetic kind of activates us up. And that's why sometimes we feel kind of this rush when we get really scared or something, we feel this rush and then it's like, boom. And that rush was all those neurotransmitters and neurochemicals that get released in the body. And then, so right after we have that kind of sympathetic activation, then our body, right, if we can't either fight or flee or fight, our body goes into parasympathetic mode, which is kind of like, instead of going into that high, we then go into kind of that crash, right? And we freeze. So what happens here is that we either literally freeze or we collapse, also known as like shut down, which is kind of, you know, we feel very lethargic, very tired. And we can also disassociate, right? So it's kind of like where our bodies are there, but our minds just went elsewhere. And we usually see that with really complex cases of trauma where those memories get fragmented and separated because you have to just kind of disconnect yourself from the event that was occurring. And when, you know, there's like this complete freeze, it's known as tonic immobility. And just to differentiate, in Spanish, para, right? Para means stop. So I usually, the way that I remember it is like sympathetic, it's like go, go, go. It's that one that activates. And then para is the one that kind of stops you. And then, right, you go into that kind of parasympathetic nervous system. The fawn response, which we didn't mention here, but is a fourth response that we can also see. And this one has more to do with people pleasing. So when you get, for example, if you work with students that they always want to appease the teacher, or the assistant, and they're trying to just avoid conflict and just, not cause like any confrontation or stuff. That people pleasing behavior comes a lot from the CPTSD or relational trauma where there was abuse. Okay. So the impact of trauma can be both visible and invisible, and it affects the cognitive and affective level. So our thoughts and our emotions, affective, physiological. So our body's responses, right? We may then suddenly be a lot more hyper-vigilant, startled, and sensitive to kind of stimuli in our surroundings. And the behavior, so the conduct, the way that we respond to things or in relationship to others. Traumatic events could impact the neurological development of a child, academic achievement, behaviors, and interpersonal relationships. We're not going to go super into details on all the areas of the brain, but just a very brief explanation of it is like, imagine it has 3 parts, right? And then it has the neocortex, which is kind of that blue area that you can see in the image. And that one focuses on all the executive functions and what we need for learning, right? Kind of a rational brain. And then we have the midbrain, which is the limbic brain. And that's where we kind of store all of our emotions and our memories. And then
the green one.
Yeah, the green one. And then the kind of, I guess that would be like orangey color. That would be our reptilian brain, which, right, is like the brainstem and the cerebellum. Right, so this is the one that gets activated when we get a stimuli that reminds us of a traumatic event or during a traumatic event, right? So what happens is, like, we usually teach the kind of triune hand model of the brain. So if you use your thumb and you close it, right? Imagine that let me go back. Imagine that this part here, right? Or where your little bone in your wrist is, that is kind of the brainstem and the cerebellum. So the reptilian brain. And then that thumb that goes inside would be your limbic brain or the midbrain. And then the one that goes up top would be the neocortex, okay? So what happens when we have a traumatic event is that this upper part of the brain, kind of imagine it kind of disconnects. And because the alarm system in here in the limbic brain is sounding, right? It's like a fire alarm. So when that fire alarm goes off, this one disconnects, and then it just sends a message to activate the lower part of the brain to then just be in survival mode, okay? You get anything? Okay. So again, in this case, the green part would be the brainstem and the cerebellum. So this is where fight, flight, freeze responses occur. we have the kind of emotional brain, which would be the midbrain or the limbic part, and then the neocortex, which is kind of our more rational brain, and where we have our executive functions, which is what we use for learning. Okay.
So another way of seeing this is that the typical development is shown in the upside down triangle to your left. Cognition takes most of our brain power and our focus. After that, we have the social emotional, then the emotional regulation, and then we have the survival mode. Yet when we experience a traumatic experience, we have a traumatic event that to survive, which is the biggest chunk of our neurological activity, then the regulation, social emotional component, and then the cognition. So it's hard to put into words the traumatic experience we're experiencing in the moment or just experiencing mode. And through that fight or flight or flee response, then we can really process verbally what we're experiencing physiologically. So this is, have to give you that warning, but it really goes deeper into this information and the research behind it. So some common responses after a traumatic event: irritability, anxiety, nervousness, anger, denial, depression, grief, headaches. I'm sure you've heard a lot of these. In the context of children and adolescents that have been affected by trauma, we can see that through stimuli that's reminiscent of the event, sounds, places, sensations, and smells provoking some being triggers and really affecting them emotionally, feeling stressed or anxious more than usual. Their body confuses past with the present. And so if they experience some type of triggering sensation, then potentially they go back to that traumatic experience and how that felt in their body. Unexpected changes. There may be a lack of direction or a change in their routine. Lack of personal power or control. This is a big one. Not having options and feeling obligated or restricted to do something. It's a biggie. I know my oldest son that's 8, gonna be 9, he will ask me, so do I have to do that? Or are you saying like you were giving me a suggestion that I should do that? And that's come after the pandemic experience. I think he really wants to be able to make his own choices, and it's hard, right? For us also having this experience and feeling somewhat out of control, that we want to make sure that the little things we can control within our everyday routines to give us a sense of relief. They also experience that in a way. So it's important to give that back to them. Feeling threatened or attacked physically or emotionally, feeling vulnerable or scared, yelling, name calling, giving nonverbal language of feeling scared, feeling ashamed. They can be humiliated and degraded. So some of these triggers can be internal or external. Internal, clearly it's harder to pinpoint since we don't know what's going on inside of them, and that's part of how art can be very helpful. It gives us an opportunity to help them externalize their internal experience in a way that's less threatening than actually talking about those traumatic experiences, since it's so hard to put into words. So I like this image. It's really representative of what Stephanie was mentioning before, of how it's the brain structure kind of it's dislocated for a moment there when the trauma event occurs. And so when we talk about working therapeutically, particularly with clients, there are bottom-up approaches and top-down approaches. If you think of bottom-up as sensory related, then it makes sense, right, that you're coming from the body up. So you help your client cope with raw emotions and their defense mechanisms by experiencing other things, be that movement therapy, be that yoga, EMDR, different expressive and modalities that incorporate the senses. And it can be very helpful, as we mentioned, because trauma is stored in the body, not necessarily cognitively, but also top-down approaches can be very helpful, like CBT and trauma-focused CBT as well, since you help put into words those experiences or images that you have, or recurring thoughts that you have, and then help the client change how they see them and perceive them and give them new meaning so they feel more empowered.
Yeah, and like if like the event just
And so we give a warning here, just in case. We're not saying we're expecting you to do therapy at all. In the same way that if a student needed a root canal, we wouldn't attempt to do that. We want to make sure that the children that are showing that they're either in a crisis or really struggling psychologically, emotionally, we refer them to the appropriate mental health services. Okay, so sometimes I've been mistaken for saying that I'm exhorting or encouraging people to do therapy when we present. That's not at all the idea. The idea is for you to leave this webinar with enough information that you understand the perspective from a clinical perspective of how trauma impacts students and even adults, and then what can you do to help mitigate that impact. These are some examples that we've incorporated into the presentation. These are expressive therapy journals. We call them diarios reflexivos, reflexive journaling or diaries. Do you want to share a little bit more of?
Maricel and Stephanie, sorry to interrupt. We have a question from one of the participants asking if you could explain some of the acronyms that you use as you're talking about them, please.
Yes, so if we're referring to CBT, that's cognitive behavioral therapy. It's proven to be due to research, one of the most effective modes of therapy, particularly trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy when we're talking about trauma. So it has the most research backing up its effectiveness. The EMDR, it stands for
eye movement desensitization, and the R, I lost the R.
I lost the R too, but eye movement desensitization is a technique that's used. Usually therapists need to be certified in it, but it's based on the movement of
and
your
bilateral
eyes.
activation, so you can integrate the memories through the eye movements. So.
And I'm not sure if there's another one I owe you, but let me know and we'll go back and let you know what it stands for. So creative journaling is it's an alternative you guys can incorporate into whatever class you teach, so that in a way you want to add to the regular curriculum of the class that you offer. Let's say it's, we did it in Puerto Rico with Spanish. So they integrated Spanish, let's say English, to certain topics that were coming up, let's say, the pandemic, because the students were not in school, some of the teachers requested students incorporate some writing activities where they would share with their grandparents their experience of not being able to see them that often, and how were they coping with that experience. And so they incorporated within their creative journal, reflective journal, that experience, and then they would share it and send a letter to their grandparents in a way to help them reconnect and get a sense of support from those loved ones that they were not being able to see.
And this activity, it comes from Eloisa Cartonera, which was a publishing house that developed in Argentina to kind of public literature in a more accessible way. And we kind of adapted it to become those reflective journals or expressive arts journals, because it's also important to have a space where kids would have a containment. Again, talking about the different boundaries between spaces, like just having a space to be able to work and put their emotional expressions in, right? And to personalize it and make it their own. So even the cover became part of that personal expression, that space of containment of them for themselves.
So the ACEs study, I'm assuming you guys have heard about it. It was done, it's a longitudinal study that incorporated a lot of families that they shared how many adverse childhood experiences they had in a particular period of time. They were categorized, and basically the results of the study over, I think it was 10 years or so, indicated that various forms of physical and emotional abuse and negligence, domestic dysfunction in the household ended up showing up in the adult's life as impact to their physical health as well as well-being. And so the ACEs study, in the short version, it just shows us of the importance to look for ways to decrease those toxic stressors in the children's lives in order to help them be healthier adults. And so in order to do that, considering more than 2/3 of the population reported having more than 3 ACEs, which is a lot, then we want to make sure to have include a protective factor, and as adults, be that protective and nurturing positive relationship in the child's life, so that potentially with the hope framework that it's a potential solution or way to decrease the impact of ACEs in an adult's later life, is to incorporate positive relationships, an environment that's supportive and provides that sense of community, connection. Toxic stresses that child has been exposed to decreases significantly. And knowing most of you are teachers, we wanted to make sure that you knew that, and that through art activities, we can foster those positive relationships, that positive and supportive environment, that sense of connection, and then help them develop those social emotional skills. So in order for within the school environment to help do that, we want to make it as predictable, consistent, positive, and safe as possible, as well as a space that's empowering, that promotes collaboration, a sense of trust, and provides them with choices because of that importance of control, right? Promoting that sense of control. So in a way, it's changing that lens of a child is behaving inappropriately, and potentially we may judge as, it's a disruptive child, for example, right? We give him that label, or potentially we think of, what's the problem in that household, to give an example. To think of what's the problem, what's affecting this child, what's happened, how can I be of help, to be curious about that behavior or misbehavior that we're seeing, and potentially even not misbehavior. Maybe it's a shutdown response, as Stephanie was mentioning before. Maybe it's internal and they're not engaging in classes, they're not engaging with their peers. And so to have that curiosity, and then that helps us shift to that trauma lens of seeing our students and kind of thinking beyond what they're showing us on the surface. Thinking, okay, there's a lot that's been going on. How can potentially I promote that connection so that I can be a safe haven and help this child develop the skills that they need. So you want to talk about a little bit about the...
Yeah, it's just, I mean, when we talk about like having a trauma lens, right? Trauma informed, trauma sensitive, it really has to do just the way that you see things. I mean, there are many people here who may speak Spanish, but I don't know if you've ever heard like, ¿cuál es tu problema, right? Like, what is your problem? We just kind of judging the person, or like based on the behavior or something they exhibit, versus that lens of like, what is happening? What is behind that behavior or that expression? And how can I assist? How can I help you? So it's about getting curious about the behavior, right? And oftentimes with children, they don't have the same tools we have as adults, and even us as adults, we sometimes don't have the tools, right? To express and to verbalize what it is that we've been through or what's going on with us. So usually with kids, you see it as either externalizing behavior, like disruptive behavior, or, they kind of shut down, they retreat, so instead of making, you never participate in class, or you're always quiet, or why are you always kind of being the center of attention, or you just, instead of kind of making them and shaming them for the behavior, I think it's really clear to first state that the problem is the behavior, not the student. So making that difference, they're not a bad kid, they're not a bad child or adolescent. Their behavior maybe wasn't appropriate or it wasn't constructive, but it's not them, right? That is the problem. And I think this is a really important part, because when kids experience a traumatic event, especially in a relational nature, they usually internalize the shame. So there's guilt and there's a sense of shame of what happened. So really important to not add to that shame. So instead of, they already feel bad, and instead of kind of making them feel worse, we want to try and first help regulate them. And we're going to see it soon in one of the 3 R's of Bruce Perry, to just be curious and then be able to assist them in that. So one thing that we talk about also is the window of tolerance. And I imagine it a lot as like a river, right? And we usually, let's suppose we're floating, we're a little fish, and we're floating kind of in the center current, and everything's chill, everything's good there. But something may happen that may scare us, and right, we may go kind of above our current, which is our optimal self. And then we can become hyper aroused. So that's when we go into the fight or flight response. We get hypersensitive. We may get very irritable, anxious. Some kids may be like raging, right?
Snappy, I get snappy.
Yeah, so that we get kind of more irritable, right? And hyper aroused. And then, but also the opposite is true in the sense that we can also become hypo aroused, right? And go into that parasympathetic state. So think sympathetic state, parasympathetic state. And then we may feel really tired, low energy, not wanting to get out of the sofa or out of bed. Or we just kind of go off into dreamland and disconnect. Or students may feel numb, right? There's like, I don't feel pleasure in anything. I just kind of feel numbed out. And that optimal level of functioning is where we can learn, when we're engaged, when we're social, calm, we're present. So that optimal self. When a traumatic event occurs, that window, right, may get smaller. It may just kind of shrink a little bit. So you may find yourself that things that maybe didn't irk you or didn't kind of throw you off balance suddenly do throw you off balance. And it's because that window of tolerance kind of shrunk a little bit, okay? And that happens to our kids too. And part of of the work of what we want to try and do is to help them kind of expand again that window of tolerance.
And the only way we can really help them expand that window of tolerance is for us to expand our own as well.
Yes.
Because we've been through the same, a lot of us have been through the same predicaments they have in the last year. And so even though we may not have the same context of either cultural background or a socioeconomic status or experiences growing up, we can relate somehow. And then we can help model that behavior of, oh, I need a moment right now. Let me take a breather, for example, which is something that's simple and it seems sometimes counterintuitive because potentially you're supposed to be teaching a lesson, right? Or if we're offering a workshop or offering therapy, that to take a second, it's like, wait, what? So being able to say, I actually need a moment right now because I'm noticing that my heart rate is getting faster, or I'm getting irritated and I'm not understanding why. And being an example by verbalizing that and taking a moment to actually go and breathe, that helps a lot in modeling the behavior, but also providing them an opportunity to then actually do that as well. And I'm sure you've experienced the modeling of behavior with students where you've done something positive or negative, and then they show it to you, be that next day or that same day. So it's very important to incorporate developing or reinforcing our own social-emotional skills so that our window of tolerance, it's not tiny, it's a little bit wider. It acknowledges that our students depend on us and look at us for reassurance.
And parting from what Maricel is sharing, so right before we get hyper aroused and hypo aroused, we kind of know, right? Before we go into kind of red light, we go into yellow light. So when we start feeling kind of dysregulated, kind of a little bit off base on ourselves, that's the moment when we want to try and recognize, and that we want to model to kind of not have to go into like our extremes.
So as opposed to react, to be more self-aware so that we can respond in a more conscious, self-conscious way, self-aware way. So arts integration to expand the window of tolerance is basically what we want to share with you. This is a little picture of an exercise we like to incorporate at times where we provide or we let the participants create a silhouette of a body, and either that small or in a big body map that with the tracing on a scrap paper, and just to simply use the colors of whatever materials they have available to represent emotions and the sensations they're feeling at that moment all around their body. And that's a nice way to help them become more aware of physiologically how those emotions are represented in different body parts. Sometimes you'll have someone who's totally focused on their tummy. Like children tend to talk a lot about, oh, my tummy hurts, right? And it's a very emotional, even IRB syndrome, the irritable bowel syndrome, there's a correlation with emotional intensity as well. So that might be a way of helping them become more aware. Oh, interesting how that tummy is so blue, and there's a little tiny point there that's dark green. I wonder what's going on there. And they may not know, or they may know, but it's a way of exploring, helping them feel comfortable exploring the body sensations and the relationship to the feelings that they're having.
And reconnect with their body, because oftentimes, you know, trauma survivors get disconnected from their body sensations, or they're having body sensations that they kind of can't understand what it is. And just like we usually talk about like the emotions and then have them label where they feel different emotions, like maybe sadness. Oh, but I feel like my throat gets tight, or if I'm scared, my knees get like jelly. So just kind of name where they feel the emotions and how they feel the emotions to develop that emotional language in smaller children. And then, but one thing that I want to talk about the exercises a little bit is like, we want to keep in mind different things. For example, when we're working with different populations, talking about the options thing as well, like we want to have papers of different colors to represent the silhouette, okay? So people can feel like identified depending on the color of their skin and what paper and materials we want to use. So that's an observation. That's something that you can have as choices. Also, when we're talking about body shapes, right? We have to be very open to just kind of have children and youth and people just express the body shape that of their choosing and express the body shape that makes sense to them, right? Also, when we talk about eating disorders, we don't know who has an eating disorder of sorts. So all these things like are just, you know, little like asterisks or stars that you have to be aware of when we're talking about creating a body silhouette, always leaving it very open to the person to just create whatever best represents them.
So integrating the arts helps to develop language and communication skills, examine cause and effect, explore other perspectives, promote intelligence or social-emotional skills, and learn ways to sublimate, transform emotions from what you're feeling, which may be a mush of a lot of different feelings, to something that can be potentially beautiful, or even if it's ugly, right? Because it doesn't need to be pretty. It's representative of what's going on inside of you. It helps you reflect and then process that experience to create some sort of meaning. That we're all artists. There's no right or wrong way of making art. You don't need experience making art to participate from art therapy. There is no coloring within the lines. Art that you create is an extension of the artist. Only the artist can interpret that art. We try to refrain from making assumptions or, oh, that seems very dark. Are you depressed? Or, oh, that horse is purple. Is that a unicorn? Or, you know, so we really leave the artist open, given the space to be open and creative and express however they want to express their perception of life and their reality and their inner life. The art we create is an external creative expression of our internal world. I mentioned that. There are guides that help us better select materials and activities that are more appropriate for students depending on the stage of development they are in, thus avoiding negatively impacting them. And that's why we want to share with you the stages of creative development from Lowenfeld and the Expressive Therapies Continuum. Some of the requirements to become an art therapist, they need to have a master's in art therapy or a master's in a related field, and then complete a graduate certificate in art therapy. Depending on the state, there are licenses now. These are some of the credentials that are available. ATR is registered art therapist. ATR-BC is registered art therapist that's board certified. ATCS is art therapist that is credential supervisor. So I won't go into the details of that, but who is not an art therapist? Well, anyone who uses art to help others or help themselves to express themselves and use it to improve their life, channel feelings, thoughts, and conflicts. A mental health professional who's taken art classes or appreciation or art therapy courses and wants to apply that. They continue to be a mental health professional in their field, but not an art therapist. And the vice versa, an artist, a professional artist who has taken some basic psychology courses or art therapy courses and applies that knowledge to a particular population they want to serve. So in the same manner, we just want to make sure we're not stating We want you to do art therapy. What we're asking you to do is to use the basic information and strategies we're sharing with you from the art therapy field and from a trauma-informed sensitive practice, to learn how to incorporate art and the visual art activities to assist students in finding ways to cope, process, and sublimate these experiences that they've had, basically expanding that window of tolerance. And so can I widen my window of tolerance? Basically, and if you want to share your thoughts on the actual image. Okay, she was the one who added it, and I thought it was a nice way of showing that, yeah, it may have been this big, but you can make it that big. And I can attest to that because after Maria, and actually I'm a therapist that goes to therapy, and I like saying that because we have to normalize it, but thank God I was doing therapy prior to Maria, and I also do neurofeedback and incorporate yoga and working out and other things. But after Maria, being a therapist, in the context of everything that had happened, it was very intense. But the fact that I've been doing therapy and then I continue and started again other personal work, it helped me expand that window of tolerance to a point that when after the earthquakes and when the pandemic hit Puerto Rico, I in my head I thought, oh, what could go wrong? And nothing can go wrong from here. And that's was a mistake to think. Clearly a lot can go wrong. But it surprised me how I was able to self-regulate in a way, even though I didn't know when this quarantine was gonna stop, or I didn't know how we were gonna be able to manage our kids being homeschooled. And it really surprised me to experience how that window of tolerance had really expanded. So I want to share with you that it is doable. It's not like a parking spot that you get there, you park, and then forever and ever you'll continue to have that wonderful, bigger or wider window of tolerance. Is something you need to continue to work on through your self-care, and also to show your students how to continue to take care of themselves so that they are in a better place to manage the challenges that life throws at them. So I
think we can skip this and go into the practical.
Okay, so there's a really cute video that you can watch later on the window of tolerance.
Sums up everything that we've said.
Right.
Okay. So I know we're not in person right now, but just think about the ways that we can also adapt it in a virtual way. But just the 3 R's from Bruce Perry is just a really, I think, useful way to think about how if we have a child or an adolescent that's just dysregulated, right? And it's like quote unquote acting out, or just kind of retreat it. Think about regulate, relate, and reason, right? And we always start with, again, think about what we talked about, the brain, bottom up. Okay, so if we have somebody who is triggered and is not feeling well, right? So first we want to try and practice different things that can help calm them, whether that's breathing or just making that eye contact, or it can be like safe touch, or just lowering to their level and try and be like, okay, let's touch this flower, or let's touch the grass, something sensorial.
Let's feel like the little doggy that's listening to that sound.
Let's hear our breath, so different sensorial things that can help the person come back to the present moment. Okay, so first is regulate. Try and come back to the present moment through sensory activities. Then relate. Okay, so think about one of the most important things to work with trauma is connection. And like Maricel said, it can just be one adult that can model that, one adult that can provide that safe, not only physical, but emotional connection with the kid. Okay, so then after regulating, relating. We might be able to connect with them, try and let them know that we validate, right? We see what they're going through.
That must have been difficult.
That must have validated their emotions.
You couldn't talk when you wanted to tell me how you were feeling, or you couldn't stop crying when you came over to me.
So being like a mirror of what's happening, basically. Think of yourself as a mirror to be like, I'm witnessing and I'm witnessing. I'm here with you as this occurred. And then after, right, we can then try and reason, especially if this is related more to behaviors, like if they did a behavior that wasn't appropriate in class. Then after we regulate, relate, and make them feel safe, then we can talk about what happened. We can't just immediately be like, why did you
tell me
that?
What happened?
Or like, you shouldn't have done that. as they're maybe potentially experiencing a flashback or a trigger. So then afterwards, once we're calm, then and that kind of rational part of the brain, the neocortex is kind of on again, right? Like plugged back in. Then we can reason and talk through that like cognitive part. So really important, both for yourself as educators or just anyone who works with communities or children or adolescents that are traumatized. You need to establish your own connections and your own systems of support, because we do experience vicarious trauma when we work with other people who are traumatized. So, and we also have our own traumas, right? Like we're not immune. We're also humans. We have our both like individual timelines and collective timelines of things that happen. That healing is not linear, right? Think about it as grief too. It's not something that it suddenly like we're good and then 4 year happens and we're still good. Like maybe 5 years later something comes up and you're kind of feeling that event very close again, right? So it's not like a linear thing. If you ever heard of the song from Ricky Martin, Un pasito pa'lante y otro pa' atrás, Maria, it's a song where it's like 1 step forward, 2 steps back. It's this kind of just non-linear thing. So it takes a lot of patience, a lot of empathy, and a lot of compassion, because those invisible wounds take longer to heal than actual physical wounds. So it should not and cannot really be rushed.
I think one example you guys can think of for your own lives, if you've loved and lost someone, for example, you may not realize, but then all of a sudden you start feeling either sad or irritable, and you notice the date. You realize, oh, the anniversary of the death of this person is coming, or the anniversary of when I started quarantine last year. It just came back, and you don't realize, but your body does realize there's something in the air. There's something similar there, and then it just takes you back to that painful experience. And so we have to be kind with ourselves and then with others. And this is a way of acknowledging that pain. And so the Expressive Therapies Continuum, in a way, it helps us structure the information processing of a person. If we think of these as levels, you have on the bottom level the kinesthetic and sensory experience. When you create art, for example, with a toddler, it can be a very kinesthetic, very movement-oriented experience. I brought in this because my oldest did it when he was younger, and it was very kinesthetic. He was all over the place, just throwing the paints and kind of, and so when we talk about thinking of the art materials and the art activity you want to bring to your student or you engage in preparation to bring it to class, it's to think of where are they at here? What age range they're at? Where are their abilities? But then also where do you want to place them so that the creative experience or the art making experience falls within this framework. So kinesthetic would be very movement related. Sensory would be also within that same level, yet in the opposite direction. That if you're towards sensory, then you're not necessarily towards the kinesthetic.
If you're scribbling really fast, right, you're more focused on the movement, versus if you're kind of using water, like finger paint, you're kind of probably more focused on the sensation. Okay, so it's like either focused on the sensation or you're focused on the movement.
Then you have on that second level, the perceptual, then affective. And so the perceptual versus affective. Perceptual referring more to your senses beyond the movement. And then affective relating to affective experiences, the feeling component to it. Then you have to the third level, the cognitive and symbolic. And so when we talk about that triangle before, remember how the executive functioning and cognitive aspects of our neurological capacity shut down because we're really in survival mode. So when we talk about being at the cognitive and symbolic level, we're talking about relating verbally to that creation that's being made, be that you came with a particular idea if you wanted to make, or you're relating to it, stating, oh, as I said earlier, well, as I focused on my breath, then I kind of noticed that I started to make a lighter kind of mark on the paper, and it was a smoother color. But so the cognitive you bring in by putting some meaning into it. And then the symbolic would be just bringing a representation that's symbolic into that art making experience. The creative level, it's like a seventh component, so that it ties all of those. In theory, an adult will be able to incorporate each one of these levels in their art making experience.
So I just wanted to pop in with a little time check. We are about 10 minutes left with the official time.
Yep. We'll move faster. So the Expressive Therapies Continuum, we encourage you to look into if you're interested in learning more. It's denser to incorporate into either your teaching practice or just in the preparation of incorporating our activities. But if you're into that kind of stuff, it really is very interesting to think about those different types of levels and what's appropriate or more appropriate for a certain type of student. When we think of the stages of artistic development, it's much more clear cut based on particularly the ages of the student. So, and this is very, I think, logical for teachers, because you can see that kids between the ages of 2 and 4, they're in the scribble stage. A lot of squiggles and marks are being made so that they learn how to control those fine motor movements. Once they start having more control, they create more representational figures, and that's the pre-schematic stage, where you can see somewhat of a almost circle with some marks become a lion, and they can say that, or so they have the first representative branch of something. Once those become more concrete and another person can say, oh yeah, I see the lion, for example, then potentially you're at the schematic stage, where between 7 and 9 years old, they develop a more definite concept of a form or a schema. And someone else can recognize it that, oh, that's a house. Even though we really don't want to judge someone else's artwork, but we want to have that lens in order to understand where they're at in their creative or artistic development stage. The nascent, I don't know how to pronounce it, nascent realism would be 9 to 12 years, because they can symbolize, and they, rather than represent objects, they get much more elaborate and more sophisticated, more precise in their artwork and art making. Pseudo-naturalism between 12 and 14 years old. They have a reasoning stage, and they add more details. They want to add the perspective and different dimensions, three-dimensional work. And the adolescent crisis, you have 14 to 17 years old or more. And this is more of the decision period. You have purposeful expression. You create things that potentially go against the norms of the world or the perspective, because they're playing more with that creative use of the creative rules. So they use their imagination to push the boundaries based on what they want to represent, and including symbolism. So this goes into the details of each one of those creative stages of development. And we've incorporated in that first bullet how we relate that to the Expressive Therapies Continuum, and we encourage you to look through those in order to feel more comfortable in whichever one of the two, or incorporating both when choosing an art activity for your students. But one that's a simple way that I want you to think about once you leave today, that's something that you can go ahead and just choose something an activity that you want to incorporate with your students so that they can kind of self-regulate, is when we think of them as art materials, if you think about them in a spectrum of more control and less control. So I'm here, there, okay. The spectrum, right? So if we think of a material that's super controlled, it would be like a Sharpie or a mechanical pencil and a ruler. You have a lot of control, precision of where that mark is going to be. as opposed to when you move more to a more fluid medium, incorporating maybe a marker, potentially a marker that you can erase, maybe oil pastels. And then after that, you have maybe soft pastels that are more fluid, they're more difficult to control and to know exactly where that line is gonna end up, because the chalk gets all over the place. Then maybe you have paints, acrylic paints, maybe then you have oil paints, which are harder to control because you have to let them dry for a longer period of time. And then maybe you have watercolors. And so in a way, when you think of your students, depending on their artistic stage of development, as well as their developmental stage in general, you want to think, do I want to promote a sense of control, or do I want to promote a sense of exploration and fluidity within the use of these materials? We know, and we've all experienced, a child that cannot necessarily manage well having water and paints and a paper in front of them. It's really hard for them to keep that sense of control and not paint all over themselves, the table, or the space that they're at. So potentially for that type of student, you want to really incorporate more controlled mediums and then move them towards more fluid, so that they can internalize that sense of control, feel better about themselves because they know what they put in that paper, it's going to be what they're imagining in their head or trying to portray. And then we help them move as they continue to feel more comfortable and be able to self-regulate better towards the more fluid. I hope that makes sense. And so in context of the different art modalities.
Yeah, I'm gonna go through this very briefly, but we're kind of concentrating today in art therapy specifically, but I work as an expressive arts therapist. So we use like intermodal transfer. We go through the different levels of the expressive therapies continuum, or from one modality of art to the other. And one thing that I just wanted, to kind of incorporate here is to know that when we're talking about trauma and we're creating maybe an artistic piece, like anything that's in writing, or although it's hard to verbalize an experience, but like visually, if I create an art piece, it's separate from me. Like I'm placing that, but it's outside of me, and it's safer than if, for example, I dramatize and enact what like a situation or what happened, because the more that I move right in that continuum, in that line towards dance and drama, the more embodied, right, I'm kind of embodying that experience. So it's kind of better to kind of stay in the visual part if we're just kind of starting out working with kind of specific traumatic events. So yeah, just wanted to know that if you kind of want to do a dance or a drama about it, more emotions may come to the surface than if we stay more in a kind of more tangible 2-dimensional or 3-dimensional modality.
Yeah. And so just to make sure that you incorporate the thinking beforehand, how to incorporate this, to think beforehand how you want to bring about these art activities to your students, we want you to think of a clear explanation of what's going to happen. So you create a safe and predictable environment. You state expectations of what their behavior should be like. When is it that you're going to start making art? When are you going to stop? What are those limits? So they know at what time you're going to be stopping and how they're going to be cleaning and being responsible for that, as well as how they need to handle the materials when they're making the art. I usually say you can paint the table, it cannot touch the floor, or you can paint the paper and the table, because the table you can clean, but you can't paint yourself. A material or activity, there are variants that you can incorporate depending on the ability of your student. And that's something that you want to think about prior to going into the classroom and bringing them the materials, so that you have modifications based on particular students' needs and potential different abilities. The respect for privacy, we want to empower them, and we want them to feel trust towards us and their peers. So we have to set those boundaries as well, and state, that this is going to be a safe place, and we are not going to ask everyone to talk about their art if they don't want to. We would like for them to participate, but you don't have to.
Never
you don't
push or force
want to.
Yeah, to have to interpret or talk about their art piece.
There's you can make mistakes. It's a safe environment. That's why pencils have erasers. There's nothing bad about that. Feel free to restart and ask for help if you need that. We want to be free from prejudice about talking about pretty or ugly. We want to express whatever they want, if it's a half person, half unicorn that they're representing, free from interpretation on our part and stating, oh, is that your father? Or, so does this mean that you were impacted by whatever thing?
And even just thinking about colors, like we may think like, oh, you drew that blue, so that must mean you're sad. And maybe the child says, no, I'm from the Caribbean and blue is like the color of the water and brings me happiness. It reminds me of, the summer. Or so always think about like, we're always like, even like when we work through art, our biases and our lenses, like we filter that information or that artwork through our lenses. So we got to be aware that we're working with children from different lifestyles and different walks of life. So refrain from interpreting and allow them to share what it means to them.
So we would like for you to practice the activity that you're going to bring to your students before you bring it to them. And that way you can experience it for yourself and then try to relate that experience you had to the different abilities and disabilities or capacities of your students. This will help you think about warm-ups that you want to incorporate, what type of routine, if someone doesn't want to participate, how are you going to handle it? And so thinking about the time allocated, the space, the rituals involved, that will be very important once you bring the activity to your students. We incorporate some ideas for technology in this presentation. Go ahead and look through later. We wanted to share with you some of the museum's collages that they have right now as part of their exhibition. And we wanted to use this inspiration to share with you the collage making component. I know we're running super against the clock, but basically we would like for you to use the 3 to 5 images that you created, collected, or printed out, and whatever other materials to create a Mula-inspired collage in representation of yourself in this pandemic time. And so we call it the pandemic selfie, but it's not necessarily a typical selfie where you look at yourself and take a picture, but in a way you're looking at yourself through this collage and whatever images you want to incorporate and represent where you're at right now. And an alternative to that, that Stephanie wanted to share with you.
Yeah, it's so, right, if we go to kind of this example or just any of them examples, like we work with mixed media too when we do collages. So one thing, if you want to think about the different levels of the expressive therapies continuum, let's suppose that you split the paper in, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 in 5 sections, and you can, right, thinking, right, of the children you may be working with or just yourself, and as a way to just kind of practice, like it would be good to choose one. I don't know if you can see it. Okay,
there you go.
But each section, right, that you split, and then maybe in one of them, I'm just gonna use colors and I'm gonna draw with movement. Like I'm just gonna focus on the movement. Do I wanna move quickly or slow?
With the kinesthetic experience.
Exactly,
right?
and just focus on the movement. And then on the other quadrant, right, I maybe just wanna focus on how the material, if I'm using crayons or oil pastels or whatever, how it feels, how the paint, like how it sounds, how it feels on the paper, right? And then, so start kind of going through those different like parts of the continuum. Like another one can be like emotion, just kind of drawing different colors that can represent different emotions that you're feeling. And then you can also then use the images from, for example, the magazines or photographs, and then use that to represent, right, a more symbolic part. So you can create the whole thing, right, with just one, like for example, just kinesthetic, and just explore fast movement, slow movement, or with different materials to explore the kind of sensory experience of each material. Or you can just kind of separate it and practice different ones for yourself so you can have that experience of what it feels like, right? We usually do collages more in this way, which is kind of image related and more symbolic. But in case, thinking about working with children, if you want to actually practice the more sensorial and kinesthetic, which is the levels we usually stay at when we want to do artwork to ground, okay? And by grounding, we mean to just come back to the present moment if we have a child that is deeply like dysregulated. And because when you think about the expressive therapies continuum, again, think about the brain, that kinesthetic sensory, goes back to that kind of cerebellum and brainstem fight, flight, or freeze response. So, and subsequently, right, it goes up into the cognitive, symbolic, and creative level.
So we would like to give you a little bit of time to make some art so that potentially someone can share while we answer some of the questions that maybe Gabriela, if you have any questions that you would want to share with us so we can answer as they make some art.
Yeah, so we don't have a lot of questions. I think there was a question regarding if we will be able to share the resources.
Yes, we will. They're part of the presentation.
Perfect. But if you all, as you're making your art, if you want to, feel free to open up your microphones and ask a question or place it in the chat while you work.
And so usually we give up some time for art making and we set some music up and then we share what we've made. I wanted to share with you a finished product as an example.
Voy a mostrar esta imagen,
Sí.
like, while they work, just so they have like a more visual.
Yeah.
Do you want me to close this off so they see your image better?
The what? That's
The
fine.
presentation?
No.
Okay.
That way they can see that as well. There you go. So that's if you want to incorporate into your collage the different levels of the expressive therapies continuum, making the kinesthetic, the sensory, the perceptual, affective, cognitive, symbolic. And so this is the collage that I had made. Let me see, there we go. It's a little weird for a pandemic selfie in that it's not maybe what you might think of. When I think of selfie, I think of portraits, but the images that spoke to me that I had collected were kind of Bali or India based. I had been looking forward to 2020 to travel for my 40th birthday. That clearly didn't happen. And so it was a way of kind of representing where I was at last year and kind of honoring where I should have been, yet ironically, I had found myself kind of putting into practice some of the stuff that I wanted to seek out and learn during those trips that I was planning. So there's no right or wrong way. I incorporated a postcard, I incorporated some images from magazines. Another was a picture that I'd taken. And so in a way, you have that freedom, and it's a canvas, but you could do it in paper or poster board. There's no right or wrong way. It's a way of simply expressing where we're at. If we can have a little background music just for the next 2-3 more minutes, that'll be helpful.
And I also wanted to know, like, because I know that some people, like, right, some students are going to school right now in Puerto Rico, at least we're still virtual. So in terms of thinking about art materials, always try to think a little bit like outside of the box of traditional art materials, right? To work with what people have in their homes or in their, you know, surroundings, and maybe in the garden or whatever, you know, found objects can also be part of a collage or whatever artworks, you create. So even if it's, for example, you want to use a fluid material, but the student doesn't have paint in their home. Well, you can maybe use coffee, right? Or you can use like, what liquids or what things can we still use that are fluid that you have in your home? Or maybe we want to create a sculpture, but you don't have like aluminum or cardboard. Well, what different like cups or little objects can you gather together and then create a sculpture with, like, you know, a spatula and a cup? so
On the paper roll, you know, about that, getting creative with the materials.
to always like, you know, we can't also assume that students either are familiar with traditional art materials as we know them. So I think expanding that concept of like what, you know, that art, we can use pretty much any medium we want as long as we have creativity. Okay, so when we work with trauma and we incorporate the arts, more than anything, we want to spark the imagination, because we, you know, people lose a lot of that sense of playfulness, of joy, of imagination, of being able to just kind of verbalize sometimes things that are really hard to put into words. Or also just taking a space where you're kind of really focused on that sensorial aspect of what you're doing versus maybe being up in your head and your thoughts, because we disconnect so much from our bodies.
Another alternative is I've incorporated sometimes printout of the student's picture. So I take a picture of them with my phone, I print it out immediately in black and white, regular paper. They cut it out, and they can make funny faces or whatever. And so we'll glue that or tape that to a bigger piece of paper, and then they create an environment around them, representing, you know, what their thoughts and feelings are. That's an alternative that's potentially less threatening than when we say within the context of either the body map or we want them to draw or paint themselves. That can be challenging even for an adult. So for a child to have to think of incorporating a nose, eyes, etc., can be daunting, particularly for those preteens and teens that are more aware of those social standards of what art is supposed to look like. So if someone would like to share, it would be ideal.
We are recording, but we can edit out when your faces pop up just to protect privacy. We wanted to record the presentation. So feel free to go ahead and turn on your cameras or your mics and share if you're willing to show us what you've made.
I'm willing to share my. So I took, I've been working on this for a while. I've been teaching online. So while I'm teaching on Zoom with my high school students, I've been making all these circles. You were talking about, you know, household things. Yes. I've been putting all that together. And so then while I was listening to you ladies, I was also adding the marker on top of it and adding another layer. So, because they were confused, and we had done a project, they got involved in a project here called Desert X, where they were doing canvases and an artist was asking them to doodle and talk about their emotions during the pandemic to then have it be an installation in a piece. And they were saying, well, I don't know what to do. And I was like, you can just start with color. You can start with line. You can make forms. So I kind of started as an idea, and then they all went in all these different directions. So yeah. And thank you.
Are you an art teacher, Maya?
I am. I'm an art teacher in Thermal, California, Coachella Valley Unified School District.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Thank you for being here. For sharing.
Late.
No, don't worry. I mean, the fact that you said using lines, colors, or shapes, that's artist talk. I figured, you know, either you had some training or you were an art teacher, because it's a nice way of kind of breaking that mentality of it has to be a certain way. When you talk about just share how you're feeling, for example, using lines, colors, and shapes, whatever that comes to mind is fine. That just brings down that expectation and brings the walls down for them as well.
So I think it helped that, yes, I went to art school, but then I taught elementary art in Los Angeles before I started teaching high school. So it's really neat right now for me to see teaching on the continuum of looking at some of these students who never had art when they were in elementary school, sadly. And so there's all these, so I was very fascinated by the continuum of creativity and all of that you were talking about, because there's skill gaps. And so to be loving and kind and create the very supportive, nurturing, safe environment, you have to start, you know, kind of building up with what they would have gotten.
Right.
but still respect the fact that they're almost adults. It's this very interesting.
I used to find myself saying a lot with older, either students, participants, clients, that you're not born dancing, you're not born running, you're not born drawing. And if the last class that you took or the last exposition you had to art making was in 3rd grade or 2nd grade, potentially those are the skills that you're gonna show. So it's natural to, you can't tango if you don't know how to potentially just, follow the beat. So baby steps. And so that helps a little to bring it to context. But yeah, I mean, that's definitely one of those challenges that we face with preteens and teens too.
And in terms of and what's interesting when we talk about as well, trauma and more than we can have somebody that can make an incredible piece of art, right? But then what if we would just want to get that person to get more in touch with what they're actually they're feeling, right? So the continuum, it's not so only in terms of the developmental level, but also in terms of emotionally and kind of brain wise, what we want to tap into. And it's really fun when we see adults and they're kind of in the kinesthetic or sensory or symbolic, to just kind of play with those areas, because all of those areas offer information to process and integrate all the either traumatic experiences or memories and stuff like that. So that's really cool. I'm so glad you shared. Thank you.
And all the resources will be in the presentation. You can either click the ones that are links or Google the ones that are references.
Yes, and we have additional resources on trauma, and some also on art therapy or expressive arts therapies that are related to trauma in the presentation. So
would anyone else like to share? We'll keep the room open for about 4 more minutes. If anyone else wants to share, if you have any questions.
Linda raised her hand.
Hi.
Hi, Linda.
I've done a lot of collage work, and for some reason today, maybe because I lost the video, I just sort of started doing something different.
It's fine.
But can you see it?
Yep.
So this was my breathing, and I have AFib. I was in the hospital, the cardiac ward. So I wrote AFib in all these little sections around here and put down heartbeat, and it's about breathing. I found myself wanting to move to text with the images, and I think I may even write all around. This one, I didn't know what on earth, but I realized it's about my dead husband. So it says, dust wasn't meant to settle. And here's a man looking out. So I think that's about him. And I cut out a flower with some clippers. And it's about changing, being able to change. And, the thorns in life might be painful and all, but you clip and you move on. And this really liked the colors and the girl and how open she was with her basket and the flowers, and then just trying to join the image together. It just really spoke to me. And then my last one was about the self-care. And I only have the one image of the woman in the, in the bed, and she's sleeping. She's working on her sleeping, which I am also, getting a new CPAP mask. So this is about self-care. I had a lot of fun doing this. Thank you.
Good, good. So did you work on all of those during the webinar?
I had cut them out when you first started, but then when I lost everything, I just started gluing them on. I thought, what am I going to do? So I just started gluing them on here and thinking about writing. I think I'm going to write on them about what's on my mind about these different topics.
So do you feel like the writing helped you either feel better, feel more in control, more in a better understanding of what you wanted to create? In what way do you feel it was helpful?
I think possibly because I'm in a writing workshop through the cancer support community, and writing has always been part of my life. And somehow this just seemed more full to me in my mind, putting some text around it. And I've never done that on a collage before, never. So this is something new for me.
So it's a shift for you. It's interesting. And you know, the images seem interesting to me because I don't know if you see if I looked at your artwork, like each page as a sequence, that first image is a bowl, but you also have the bowl with the girl as well, but it's more open. I guess that first one has food, but then you'll have food, then you have nature with the representation of your husband, and then you have the flower. So there's a nature component that seems to kind of repeat, but also that full plate, yet you have another plate that's empty later on. It's an interesting sequence of images that seem to kind of relate there for me. I don't know if you would be into incorporating some sort of story to it, but they seem to relate in some way.
This one for me was also about patience and letting things steep, literally, you know, and nature. The other day I went to the South Coast Botanic Garden. They have their wonderful butterfly exhibit. So I was walking around the gardens having a wonderful time. So anyway, thank you, because I thought this was really fun and, like I said, very different for me, because I've never ever used me writing text on an image.
Well, we're happy you enjoyed it, and thank you for participating. We were the first one we could see when we were presenting, so it was nice to kind of get a sense of there's someone there paying attention.
Oh yes.
So thank you.
Thank you.
And that's why we encourage people to kind of do the exercises that they want to do with their students or with whomever they're working with, because you also experience it and you learn things about yourself through the process, and then you're better able to facilitate it for them. And what Maricel was just doing, right, she was kind of reflecting those observations. She was kind of mirroring back what she was seeing. She wasn't interpreting, right? I was observing, it's like she was just kind of being that mirror and showing back what she was kind of like witnessing through the pieces. And I just want to point out, Maya, you said something really important as well when you guided them, like that you said, oh, my students kind of have this blank canvas and they didn't know where to start. And you said, well, start with like a shape or a line or form. And oftentimes, like in terms of emotionally, that happens when we work with children and youth too. If we're going to work on an art piece, if kind of you see that they get really overwhelmed by just having like a blank piece of paper, we usually, and oftentimes Maricel says, like, just draw a circle, right? Let's start with a shape and then let's create inside of that circle. So you create a containment for them to kind of start from. And it may be safer for some students. Other students may need to just kind of they start with a paper and they don't end up with a sculpture, you know? So
there's no right or wrong way, Linda. We're happy you continue to make art despite losing the video, and you took something out of this webinar. So
I think Maggie had her hand